And I would like to just introduce you to his work very briefly and then give you the floor, Mario. So if you haven't read Dr. Sifuentez' work, I really encourage you to do so. He published a book recently, Of Forests and Fields, and here he, as an environmental historian, discusses the contributions and the lives of ethnic Mexican immigrant workers in Oregon and Washington. And a part of this book that was particularly, I think, meaningful to me was reading about how undocumented immigrant workers have been part of the reforestation work that have shaped both states. Their participation in labor rights movements that is really important because it kind of has guaranteed rights for forestry and agricultural workers today. And he also makes a compelling argument that forestry should be considered part of agricultural labor. It is a really stunning recovery of this labor in our region, and I encourage everyone to acquaint themselves, if you haven't already, with Dr. Sifuentez' work. He is an associate professor of history and focuses on environmental history at UC Merced, and he is also currently the director of the Center for Humanities. His current work is on water, food, and farm workers in California's Central Valley, and today he's going to invite us to think about the relationship that people of color have with the Pacific Northwest landscape and how we create a home for ourselves here. So with that, Mario, I will cede the floor to you. I'm going to hide myself, but I'll be here keeping track of the questions. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm really happy to be talking to you, to the Tacoma Tree Foundation, and the audience members, particularly because once I got the invitation, I started to do some research and look at your organization, and I think it's sort of the perfect blend, right, of the kind of environmental work that needs to be done in today's society, particularly when we're thinking about questions of redlining in neighborhoods and how neighborhoods end up the way that they are, and the kind of deprivation that neighborhoods have suffered. And when we think about resources and resources being put into neighborhoods, we're usually thinking along the lines of schools or hospitals or jobs or things like that. But equally important, if not more important, are questions of environmental racism and quality of life. And I think those things are typically understood as maybe superfluous or luxuries or things like that. And we don't understand them as essential and important components of social justice movements, and in particular in the Pacific Northwest. And there's a famous environmental historian by the name of Richard White, who wrote an article many, many years ago that was called "Are You an Environmentalist or Do You Work for a Living?" And it was a commentary on a bumper sticker that was very popular in the logging movements, and we were sort of like loggers versus environmentalists in the fight to save the spotted owl, for instance, right? And it was an article really sort of juxtaposing how working people saw themselves separate or distant from the environmental movement that was placing, in their parlance, right, placing animals above people and the rights of animals above people. And so that he really sort of sets the tone in the early 1990s for historians to really start thinking about environmental history and working class history as a way of sort of trying to debunk this idea that these are two separate two separate concerns, right? And that the labor movement had historically been focused primarily on jobs and getting jobs and having good paying jobs, et cetera. And environmentalists were focused on sort of saving animals or trees or other species, et cetera. And what the new kind of generation of environmental historians has done is understood that these things are linked, right? And that they're all linked, they're ecologically linked, and that our quality of life depends largely on the environment that we live in. And so I want to sort of talk a little bit about how that plays out in the Pacific Northwest, in particular because historically, again, the labor movement in the Pacific Northwest has been understood as being driven by white working class people. And so what I think my work does is to try to introduce the sort of marriage there between, and the conflict there between environmentalists and working class people, and in particular Mexican immigrants, and the way that Mexican immigrants in particular come to understand the environment that they live in and alter and shape the environment that they live in. And so while I will look at environment or think about environment, there's also other ways in which that environment is shaped. I think the work that's being done at the Tacoma Tree Foundation is certainly one of the most, certainly important kinds of work, but there's other kinds of work that's being done that has maybe not understood as environmental per se, but hopefully make the argument that it is. One of the things that I always talk about with farm work in particular, and working in nature, right? And I think it's important for us to sort of think about agricultural spaces as natural, even if it's not sort of pristine, right? The way that we imagine nature, and as well as understanding nature as labor. And so one of the things that I always talk about, or I always tell people about, is that my father was a farm worker. Regardless of sort of what the day was like, would come home and work on his garden, right? And so you would think that somebody who had spent all day laboring in the fields would also want to come home and labor in the garden, right? And what is sort of fundamentally what I sort of misunderstood for a long time, or didn't understand for a long time, is that the work itself, right, is dignified, right? It's important work. It's work that makes him feel a certain way, but it's the other levels of oppression that sort of come and denigrate the work of being on your hands and knees and digging through the dirt, because there's something about that environment, about that space, that he found comforting, that he found joy in, right? And so when we think about sort of community gardens and some of these other spaces, in particular within like an urban location, it's more than just feeding people, right? Or it's more than just producing your own food. There's also some level of worth and belonging in place that takes place in those community gardens, and especially in immigrant community gardens. So because we're thinking about, growing, especially before the kind of the movement, the food movement that has brought lots of new kinds of foods and vegetables and stuff into more mainstream America. But we're thinking about sort of Thai immigrants, for instance. One of my former students, Mark Padungpat, wrote a book about Thai food in the United States, where he sort of talks about, these surreptitious gardens that Thai immigrants would start because there were certain products that were banned from being imported into the United States for various kind of agricultural reasons, and how the Thai community sort of grew an identity in Los Angeles, right, through food and through gardening, various different products like kaffir limes, for instance. And so there's this great story that he shared with me anecdotally, where the only place that you could get a kaffir lime was in one of the UC's experimental farming stations, right? And so there was a group of Thai immigrants that would break into the UC garden and take kaffir limes and take parts of the tree to replant elsewhere. And so it shows you sort of the extent to which people will go to try to bring a part of them home, right? To bring a part of their home to wherever their home is now. And so we think a lot about the way in which that space becomes incredibly important. And so, if we look at a place like Tacoma, Mount Rainier or Mount Tacoma was one of those places, right, that indigenous people in the area understood in a particular kind of way. And there's some really good work that's being done now, or it's been done recently, by people like Lisa Blee, right, who think about that indigenous people don't just have like a spiritual relationship to a place. They also have an economics of the place, right? They also have the place is also important because of what it grows and what it provides, right? And not just this kind of metaphysical or existential relationship to a place, which, you know, Anglo settlers love to sort of play up as a way of diminishing or denigrating that kind of relationship, right? And seeing it as a waste, or seeing it as a failure to properly use the space. And so there's a number of different ways that I think that we can think about these things, right? Whether it's the sort of the economy of place, whether it's community gardens, whether it's tree planting. I recently was in a seminar with some graduate students who were talking about this idea of belonging and how important this idea of belonging is. But specifically when we're talking a lot about immigrants or migrants, that place of belonging actually becomes a way of behaving, right? Because belonging suggests permanence, or it suggests, many immigrants feel them as if they want to go back to their homes, or if they're migrating from place to place, and that the behaving actually gives them more of a sense of something that they can take with them, right? And so one of the examples that we sort of think about it in that sense is, music making, right, and cultural production. And so that there's these kind of new forms of music that are being developed that speak particular to an immigrant experience. For instance, if you look at a group like Los Tigres del Norte, for instance, the idea ultimately, right, is that the majority of their songs are about the kind of immigrant experience, and that's those songs travel through these networks of migratory networks that make people feel at home, even if their home is not necessarily a consistent place. And so we look at the Pacific Northwest, which has historically had obviously a very, very militant sort of expulsion and segregation of people of color, and how people of color made home out of no home, right? And so, for instance, with Mexican immigrants, one of the first kind of signifiers or spatial recognizers that people were making a home a permanent place in the Pacific Northwest was through the building of tortillerias, right? And so the operating of a tortilleria is sort of an indicator that, there is a migrant community here, and that migrant community is coming in and out of this space. And even though it might not be the same people who are working in the fields every single year, there is an expectation that there will be Mexican immigrants in this space at this time, right? And that really gives rise to the first kind of permanence of people who can stay and exist in that space. And so I always look at like ethnic restaurants or ethnic businesses in that way, not necessarily as like a success story of an entrepreneur or anything like that, but more as a way of thinking about how those spaces, those businesses provide a sense of permanence to people who are coming through those areas, even if they're not specifically permanent. The other example that I like to use is radio stations, right? And so one of the things that that's always been sort of etched in my mind in the experience of Mexican immigrants in the Pacific Northwest is the initial kind of lack of Mexican radio, Mexican or Spanish language radio on the airwaves. And so for the longest time, that sense of belonging was measured by country music, which of course is prevalent throughout the region. And so country music became a marker of a generation of an age group, right, of certain Mexican immigrants that were here who know Johnny Cash and Freddie Fender and Merle Haggard, et cetera, right, who became quintessential to that experience until the arrival of Spanish language radio in the Pacific Northwest, which coincidentally enough was the first radio station, Mexican American radio or Spanish language radio station in the Pacific Northwest was in Yakima, right? And so those kind of spaces, right, those kinds of things, I think about all the different ways in which you can create community or make a place out of no place, right? Make a home out of no home. The other example that comes from Yakima as well is the institution and the creation of, for instance, Japanese baseball leagues, right? Sports leagues and baseball teams were a major component of that community creation as well. And so we look at, for instance, the existence. There's a Wapato and Yakima and I'm forgetting Pasco, right, all have sort of Japanese baseball teams before World War II, the Nisei generation that really created a sense of community and belonging. And in this case, sort of a particular kind of Americanization as well, right, that taught the kind of ideal kind of Americanization program in the eyes of many of the Japanese elders, right, in which they're trying to create a space. And although it's thought of or understood as like sort of an all-American space, it's still very much a Japanese space, right? They still very much have, Japanese names for the teams, like the Nippon, the Wapato Nippons. They have Japanese characters on their jerseys. They play other Japanese teams. They host tournaments for Japanese celebrations. And so despite the fact that it's a vehicle that is very much an American institution, just like country music is, right, there is a way in which ethnic people bring their own identity and their own sense of belonging and make it their own, right, in a way that that claims space, right? And of course, that holds true for the Japanese. I write about it in my book. It holds true for Mexican immigrants in the Pacific Northwest. And in the case of my work, it's actually the Japanese who facilitate, right, the building and the infrastructure that allows for Mexican and Mexican American baseball leagues to form in a place like Ontario, Oregon, where I'm from, and what I write about in the book. And so you have this group of Japanese growers who are living in the Pacific Northwest, or who are living in Ontario, Oregon, in particular, sort of Malheur County, who have become these niche growers of onions in that region, who have obviously a familiarity with what it means to try to become American, and also having that snatched away from them during World War II, and then coming back to that area and providing the same kind of infrastructure that existed for them for Mexican immigrants to the Pacific Northwest. And so, for instance, in Ontario, Oregon, there's the outside of Seattle it was the first Buddhist temple outside of Seattle, and they had a Japanese hall, and there was a large free Japanese population that lived in Eastern Oregon and Malheur County at a time when most Japanese on the West Coast were interned or were forbidden from living anywhere else in the area. And so when Mexicans start to arrive in the Pacific Northwest as laborers, as migrant laborers, the Japanese provide dance halls and baseball fields and sort of begin the organization and the infrastructure that allows the Mexican community to feel at home, to feel or create some sort of space there. And so it's recreational, but it's also in terms of living, the Japanese were the only people who would rent, right, to Mexican families that were traveling into the region. And so that's kind of an example of how things work in the Pacific Northwest, right? In terms of, well, I should say it works everywhere, but the examples are in the Pacific Northwest. And I think these examples become increasingly important when we think about the history of the Pacific Northwest and the large-scale kind of anti-Chinese or anti-Asian movements that existed in a place like Tacoma and places like Portland. And, what I think what it demonstrates is how important these things that don't seem political or don't seem radical are to the formation in the community and the building of community in these spaces, right? And so again, I think somebody might look at the Tacoma Tree Foundation and look at the planting of trees and say, well, how does this matter, right? This is not this is not sort of radical enough, or it's not labor organizing, it's not really organizing, it's not really this, et cetera. And I would, in looking at the way that that work is rooted in the histories of exclusion and the histories of racism and redlining, I think it becomes incredibly important, right, to create spaces that are livable, that are welcoming, that improve the quality of life for communities of color and immigrant communities. And so I think that's sort of how I like to approach the work, right? Is thinking about how these things intersect, and the way in which belonging and behaving really meet to sort of coalesce around these issues of environmental racism, and that no kind of struggle or no kind of effort is too small or unimportant, right? And I think this was one of the things that sort of ran through my work, was that as a labor historian, originally trained as a labor historian, I was expecting to see sort of strikes and organizing and unionizing and these big movements and these big marches and all of these things. And while those things do happen at various times in history, what really leads to those moments is these little acts of resistance along the way, right? These little acts of playing baseball, listening to music, of opening up a tortilleria, right? Eating the foods that you want to eating the foods that you want to eat, growing the foods that you want to grow, right? And ultimately, and planting the trees that you want to plant. And eventually those things coalesce into these, I think, larger movements and these larger interventions, and these larger, what Gramsci might recall, these wars of maneuver. And so, for instance, right now, the work that I'm doing is focused on water in the Central Valley. And I'm sure if you guys are paying attention to California, there's always struggles over water and water deliveries and drought. And there's been tomes and tomes, that have written about water politics and water policies and how they, affect growers in cities. But there's been very little in terms of what's happened on the ground in farm worker communities all throughout the Central Valley, and how they're able to, what struggles they have with water and basic potable water in their homes. And so a lot of the larger struggles that have emerged with large organizing capacities, like the Leadership Council or the Community Center for Water, the Community Water Center, really start out with small acts, right? With these small communal acts of, sharing water or transporting water for each other, that have really evolved into a large scale movement here in the Central Valley. And so now I'm looking at the kind of historical roots of how those things grow to become what they are today. And so I think as sort of climate change and, really starts to ramp up these questions and these existential threats to our existence, even the Pacific Northwest, I think, is going to have to deal with issues of water and water quality and water scarcity, and fires and all those things that California has been sort of dealing with for the last 10 or 15 years in terms of environmental catastrophes, right? And if we can't find a way, right, to connect those struggles, those things, like a forest fire, for instance, to the everyday lived experiences of people in an urban community in Tacoma, then I think we're going to really miss an opportunity to come up with potential solutions, to come up with power struggle, to come up with answers to these power struggles and these questions of equity and sustainability in our communities. So that's kind of the background, of what I do and what I bring, trying to sort of think about some of the questions that pertain to the Pacific Northwest. In some ways, I wish I was still there so that I can keep writing about it. But I have the two small children, so the closer I am to my sources, the easier it gets for me. So again, I want to thank you all for inviting me, and I want to take this time to open it up to. Sorry about that. Questions to the audience and to the members.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sifuentez, so much to think about, and I really appreciate the way you connected the kind of the ways in which different communities support each other as they're in order for them to create home, like the examples that you gave, baseball, and radio stations, and also how you note that a lot of questions of belonging that we kind of take for granted have to be problematized or just made more complex. Belonging is can be temporary in a place, and still be meaningful. So I really appreciate so much of what you've said, and I'd love to hear what questions our attendees have. I generally it takes me like a few minutes to come up with a question, so I'll give people a little bit of a chance to think about what questions they have. But the other thing I want to say is also I really appreciate how you're connecting it to the work TTF is doing, and we've been actually just recently having conversations about what it means to do, well, to call what we do environmental justice, and what that calls us to, how that calls us to think about our work, and how we explain that and what it means to us, to the people that volunteer with us or to the people that we're serving. So I think there are other important questions that arise from that. So I'll give people a minute or two to ask a question. We do have a comment from one of our attendees, Vivian, who says she thanks you for coaching kids, which is an underappreciated way of community support. So that's a thank you from one of our attendees.
Yeah, I mean, I think also just kind of piggybacking off of that idea, right? Is that I think one of the most sort of understated or underestimated kind of points of environmental justice work is green space, right? And especially when it comes to kids, right? As I coach mostly sort of underserved kids, and even the thing like trying to find practice space, right, becomes that map, that redlining map, right, that you have in your head of your city, of your space. Like it becomes very, very like apparent of what that looks like when you're trying to find even space for your kids to play and coach kids. So for instance, I live in southwest Fresno, and northeast is Clovis, is a suburb, right? And so if I go out there, there's soccer goals everywhere, there's lighted fields, there's green space, there's all those things, right? And so it's not necessarily tree planting per se, but it is this question about green space and parks and recreation, in which I think everyday people and working class people feel it more than, say, like questions of climate change in the aggregate, right, in the large scale warming of the planet, right? And when we talk about environmental justice movements, again, what I started the conversation with is this separation, is this segregation of working people and environmental issues. And the places in which you can make that one and the same, I think very easily and very clearly to working class people, is parks and recreation. Like what's available for my kids to go play, to go outside, to be out late, right, and be out under the lights, or be out in green spaces, has, like, I think I understood it very much in terms of like as an academic, but then as a parent, it's much clearer to me than it's been before. And I think that's one way that that environmental work can really like make inroads into communities of color and working class communities.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, no, absolutely. One of our participants, Vivian, is highlighting one of the things that you just said about how, especially like at this time of year in places like the Pacific Northwest, when it gets dark so early, so your kids are going to be, in green spaces or trying to find green spaces to play in, and if there's no lighting or if there's no infrastructure for those activities to take place in ways that are safe and that encourage community, you're already excluding and denying home to a number of neighborhoods and the people who live in them. So yeah, definitely that's another important.
Yeah, there's an organization here in Fresno called Peace, Love, and Football. And their whole thing, you know, is they play pickup games every Monday. You know, they do this kind of outreach to the community through pickup games. But what they're sort of there, they are kind of a de facto like parks and recreation or grassroots organization, because they are able to mobilize all of the people who come and play in their pickup games to go down to city council meetings when they're trying to decide where to put in lights, where to put in parks, where to do. And they just had a big victory recently where they got 5 futsal, which is like, you know, futsal courts approved in working class communities, right? And so like we have to be creative like that when we're doing organizing in the community. And so they, you know, they can sort of downplay what they are by saying, oh, we're just a group of folks that like to play soccer out, you know, like to play football, like to play futsal. We're not political, but they are deeply, deeply political, right? And it's a way in which they're able to get a large contingent of people to show up on a Tuesday night at a city council meeting, you know, to protest the building of like you know, pickleball courts in the North Clovis or in North Fresno, as opposed to futsal courts in South Fresno. So you know, it's that kind of belonging, right? That's the question of like, it's just soccer, it's just football, but no, it's way more than that, right? That question of belonging and behaving is much, much deeper than simply, you know, trying to just play.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a whole sense of community and what's possible for that community. Yeah, Vivian is just agreeing with you. And then we have a comment from Alejandro, who says, we have an issue here in a red line district where there is a lot of people of color. The city declared an environmental emergency, yet they are still allowing large companies to build large warehouses in this community. What are your experiences in this neighborhood and these neighborhoods, and how can the residents change policies in your experience to allow for more green space? Oop, yeah, you're muted.
I think there's 2 organizations in California that have done a really tremendous job of this kind of work. One, I gotta remind me of the name here, but one is in the Pajaro Valley near Riverside. Done work with them before about, and Riverside is one of these examples, right? Because Riverside is the kind of like the logistics hub for like all of Southern California. And so all of these corporations have built these large scale warehouse and distribution centers in these areas. The Imperial Valley is the other one in which they built these kind of the warehouses where like trucks are coming in like 24 hours a day, like, you know, disrupting sort of sleeping patterns and doing, you know, all this kind of work. And so the Pajaro Valley, it's called Regeneración. So regeneration is the name of the organization in the Pajaro Valley. And so they do a lot of great work on basically they've had to do work on zoning laws, right? And so trying to get areas rezoned, dezoned, they're trying to do all this work. And the zoning laws in particular are work in this kind of clandestine network in most places. I don't know, you have to look to see how it happens in Tacoma, right? How are zoning laws passed or unpassed? In the Pajaro Valley or the Imperial Valley, it's literally like a 3-person committee, right? And so they had to like put extensive pressure on a handful of people to make really, really big changes. And although I mean it sounds easy on the one hand, on the other hand, these people get a lot of kickbacks, right? There's a lot of it's a very lucrative position to hold in public service. And so what I would suggest for Tacoma, right, is to figure out how the zoning laws are changed and figure out who the people are who make those zoning law changes, like whether it's a board, whether it's a commission, whether it's city council, whether, you know, what it is. And then trying to figure out, are those people elected? Are they not elected? Are they appointed? Who are they appointed for, by? And then that's how you start trying to find the pressure points, right? And so For instance, the community water center here in California, in the Valley, has figured out that the water boards, so there's literally called the water board, right? Like not the torture, but like, like they're literally called water boards, and they make decisions on who gets water and who doesn't in a particular kind of watershed, right? And they found that those people are elected, but that 98%, this study was done about 10 years ago, but that 98% of those elections, people ran unopposed, right? And so the community water center started to train, do leadership trainings, to where they would train local residents in how in civil service, in community projects, in local government, and then train them to run for those positions so that they could then challenge these folks. 9 times out of 10, it was like, so and so, like some water executive's brother that ran for the water board in a particular community or neighborhood. And so that was they were able to they were able to turn those seats over at an impressive rate once they started to do that work. So for Tacoma, I would say like that's the important step, right? Is to map out the power. How do things get changed? Zoning laws, I think, is going to be the primary way of preventing those things from continuing to come in. Because they can declare an environmental disaster all they want. If we're talking about kind of like Superfund zones and those types of things, I mean, those things take forever to get funded and cleaned. And by that time, you have cancer clusters and these other things that have emerged that are too late. And so I would suggest that zoning would probably be the way that you attack that problem, right? So think about how those decisions get made in Tacoma.
Well, one question I have, which it kind of, what would you say is the way in which the Mexican laborers that you have studied and that participated in reforestation work in the Pacific Northwest, what were important ways for them to in that really brutal hard labor that they had to do while fighting for their labor rights? Are there any kind of examples? How, and I know you cover very different groups throughout the book. Would be great to hear about.
Yeah, so I think it sort of depends on the era, I think, in a lot of ways, right? The sort of Bracero era was marked by really sort of impermanence, right? I mean, and not just involuntary impermanence in many ways as well, too, right? So like, not only were they moved around from camp to camp or forest fire to forest fire by the BLM or by federal authorities, they also left, right? And so I think a lot of the times we think of undocumented immigrants or undocumented immigration as people who have crossed the border without papers, but the reality of it is that many people come with a work contract, find it untenable, and they leave, right? And they go to other places. And so for me, that became the kind of major example of resistance that took place in the Bracero era, was mobility, was the ability to go somewhere else. And so again, we often think about these movements as constrained and forced and like, sort of top down, but there was just as much movement, if not more, from the bottom up, right? It was also migrants that found a place unbearable and they went somewhere else, right? And again, that's not to minimize the kind of exploitation and suffering, but it's just to show that people had agency even in the most constrained conditions. And so one of the things that I write about in the book is the different places, like there would be, one of the features of the Bracero program is that you had to make a large request for a number of bodies. And so a lot of the times it was larger growers. The Bracero program was really a benefit to major agricultural corporations and not so much to like a family farmer, for instance. And so one of the ways in which, small farming operations combated that was by offering higher wages. And so they offered higher wages, and braceros would skip out, what they called skip out of their contracts, right? And they would go to to other places. Small family growers would called it bootlegging. They would bootleg labor. And so that movement became a really important thing for braceros, that even at the risk of becoming undocumented or becoming deportable, they often did it, and they often found better situations and better work. That was one of the things that really was crucial to their survival, right, and their well-being in the United States. The other thing that I think from all that we did, for the folks who are in the audience that aren't familiar with my book, it really sprang out of a project called the Bracero Oral History Project that me and probably about 10 other graduate students and 4 professors at the time were awarded a grant from the Smithsonian to create this Bracero Oral History Project. Leonard Nadal was a photographer for the Works Project Administration that took photos of all these braceros, but in his archives were eventually deposited at the Smithsonian. And so the Smithsonian had thousands of photos of braceros, but really had no context for what they were, who they were, what their lives were like, what their names were even. It was just sort of like this, a bracero at a camp at this place, right? And so the Smithsonian wanted to do an exhibition on the braceros, and they sort of showed my mentor at the time was at Brown University. They showed him the photos, and they said, "Well, what can you do with this?" And he said, in many ways, putting up these nameless, unidentified people on an exhibit continues to do violence to them in a way that was perpetuated by the SOTA program and is now wants to be perpetuated by the Smithsonian. And so the Smithsonian says, "Well, what do you suggest?" And he says, "Well, I suggest we do an oral history project. And we try to find who some of these people are. We need to try to identify the photos. We try to identify the camps. We try to identify the process." And so over the course of 5 or 6 years, we received millions of dollars from the Smithsonian to create the oral history project and to begin conducting oral histories with braceros. And so what that turned into was we were going into communities in Mexico and in the United States that historically had large populations of braceros working in them in the Imperial Valley. And we did one in Portland, we did one in Chicago, where we would go out into the community and we would speak on Spanish language radio or Spanish language television stations and newspapers, and we would say, "Hey, we're from the Smithsonian. We're interested in talking to people who are braceros that were working from this year to this year. We want to hear your stories, and so come out to this salon, or this church or this whatever at Friday night at 6:00, and we're going to do a whole presentation for you to show you what it is." So we would do this bilingual presentation. Most of the time, it was braceros children that would show up. Adult children that would show up and say, "Oh, my father was a bracero. Like, what's this all about?" And so we explain to them what we're trying to do, collect these oral histories. We want to put together an exhibit, we want to do all this. And so then the next morning, Saturday morning, say, "Hey, if you're interested, come out. We're gonna interview folks." And the first time we did it, we were in the Imperial Valley in a little place called El Indio, and we had spent so much money. We were sitting there Friday night eating dinner, and we're like, "Man, what if nobody shows up? Like, what do we do if nobody shows up?" And this was our biggest, El Indio was if we can't get people here, we're not going to get people anywhere. And so we went to bed and we woke up the next morning, 6:00 in the morning or something. We go down to the library where we're setting up our interviewing. Actually, it wasn't a library. It was a VFW or something. And it was we're gonna set up. And by the time we showed up, there was already a line. There was already a line of all these old Mexican dudes. And I was like, "Yeah, of course, we're not going to beat old Mexican guys out of bed. We're just not going to do it. They're going to beat us out of bed every time." And so we get there, and it was beautiful. It's a lot of these men had not seen each other for decades. They were talking, they were chatting it out. It turned into this beautiful, like every single city we went to was the same thing every time. Huge lines, lots of people. We did it for, we're conducting, but at this point, I think total we have over 1,000 interviews. At the time, we ended up getting about 600 interviews in about 2 years over the course of summers and winter breaks and things. And again, the Merced program has a history of being, and a well-deserved history, reputation of being an exploitative, oppressive system of labor control that benefited American growers, no doubt about it. But one of the things that we found was this like great stories of joy, right? And great stories of resistance and great stories of making place. And so, one of the, stories that you would tell stories about dances or music or guitar, or one of the first time they bought a radio. We would hear stories, especially in Oregon and Washington, of like Mexicans like sneaking away to go to the reservation to meet up with girls, right? Like there's all of these stories that we were finding of resistance, of this beautiful humanity in the face of this really terrible living space, right? These really terrible living conditions and pain. And so this is where I would hear stories about them, skipping out and going to work other places, and all these things. And part of it is a product of like, we're interviewing people who remember it fondly to a certain degree, right? Like, and so there is some bias in that, but it was also at the same time like a part of a history that nobody had talked about, right? And nobody had said and told. And so, while some of the stuff with the post World War II stuff with the Japanese growers and things becomes a little bit more concrete. The Bracero stories really began that chain migration to the Pacific Northwest, right? People found home. People would return year after year after year with or without a contract to work for particular growers, to work for particular places and particular communities. Like Woodburn, for instance, where they found people who were in Ontario, they found people who were sympathetic and who were empathetic to their situations that gave them long-term viability, right? And so like, if you look at, so if in my personal archive, I have the letter of the Japanese farmer who sponsored my grandfather to come, to their farm, and then eventually to sponsor my dad and my grandmother to come over to the United States. And so it's that movement away from sort of large growers that really sparks, I think, the large scale immigration that eventually happens to the Pacific Northwest and changes the Pacific Northwest as we know it, right? And so like, there was certainly a time when I was writing this book when people would ask me like, oh, I'm writing about Mexicans in the Pacific Northwest, and the response would be, there's Mexicans in the Pacific Northwest. And I don't get that question anymore, right? I don't get that anymore. I don't get that people have understood the kind of like the massive effect that immigration has had on these communities that have historically been exclusionary, right? And so that kind of belonging has taken place through all of these different tools, right? All of these different methods. And again, and that's why I also, me and a couple of grad students have been workshopping this idea, right, of behaving versus belonging. Because, while my grandfather never necessarily belonged in Oregon, he felt at home to be himself when he was here, right? And to bring people with him. And so like, there was my grandfather never settled, right? He kept going back and forth, back and forth. It was my father that settled. It was his son that eventually settled, but it had everything to do with the kind of behaving, right, versus belonging. And I'm not sure if we're going to land on behaving, but it is something about acting and behaving, and like I said, eating what you want, planting what you want, speaking what how you want. Like all those things are maybe not as permanent as a house, right? But there is a space that is permanent in all of that. I don't know if that makes sense. And again, even if it's not the same people returning to the same space, the space has been altered to such a degree, right, that like people come and people, like, you think about now with like the work that Pekun does, their trilingual radio stations, right?
Mhm.
And so like, oh, now now it's not just Spanish, right? Now it's Triqui, right? Now it's Zapotec, now it's all these other things. It's all these celebrations, right? It's again the various different indigenous celebrations that take place that make that is a behavior, right? That creates that belonging, even if it's not like, well, my family's settled, we belong. No, we've changed the landscape to the degree that all kinds of people feel like they belong here now, and all kinds of people feel like they can occupy this space.
Yeah, no, that distinction that you're making,
that distinction that you're making,
I think is something I want to think about it. And reflect on it carefully, because it is, at least in the moment right now, it's making me think a lot about the emphasis purchasing a home or a house, to kind of say I'm from here, or property being the way in which you make a home, and kind of asking us to rethink that in terms of landscape changing, which could involve greening, for sure, but also being able to plant the foods, the culturally appropriate food for your community, there's some other people, as being a way in which you make food. So it's a really powerful distinction.
Because the double-edged sword with sort of like with belonging in terms of property ownership or belonging, or physical belonging, right, is that we still sort of exist within this capitalist real estate market, right? And so that like you can very quickly unbelong to a place, right? There's a lot of ways in which taxes and rent, all of these things, that gentrification, that can very quickly unravel generations of belonging, right? And so there's has to be other ways, right, that we not to give up, but right, that's not what I'm suggesting, but just other ways of claiming a space, right? That makes it hopefully untenable, right, for that process to take place.
Yeah. Yes. That's something we will be talking about. I think a lot of the people who are with us today are members of our board, and they volunteer with us and green with us. So they're very much I'm interested. What their thoughts are. I'm interested. So I think we're coming up on an hour. It's 7:07. If there's no more questions, I'm going to just thank Dr. Sifuentez so much for despite all of the logistical and personal obstacles and difficulties. Thank you so much for making time for us and for sharing all of the stories and the important kind of distinctions that you're asking us to think about. We have some thank yous from participants today, Q&A as well. And you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, go to our YouTube channel, or just email us with any questions you might have. Thank you again so much to everyone who was here and to Dr. Sifuentez. I'm sure we will continue to think about everything you shared with us today. Thanks, everyone, and thank you again, Mario.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Thanks.